Hi, this is Mark Middlebrooks, back with some more important information. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about money and the expectations of how much money is going to be necessary from a borrower or a buyer, the expectations of where that money is going to be going, how it's going to be used, and where it can potentially come from. Okay, so I'm going to start at the top here with the three things that are going to be up front. These are going to be necessary up front. That first one is the earnest money. Earnest money is when you're submitting your offer and letting the seller know that you're a serious buyer, and that earnest money is tied to the seriousness of your offer. So that's obviously a pretty important part of submitting a successful offer, especially in this market. Next thing is inspection. So that is to have a professional inspector inspect the property. The last is the appraisal. So this is also necessary up front, is to pay for that appraisal. Now, where can this money come from? So while it needs to come from the buyer or the borrower up front, there are a couple different ways that maybe this can be reimbursed or covered by a different part of the transaction. Earnest money, for instance, could potentially come from some kind of assistance program, down payment assistance program. It's not going to be able to come from the seller, and it's also not going to be able to come from interest rate or adjusting the interest rate. The way that that would be covered by down payment assistance would be that the purchaser or the buyer comes up with that money up front, and then later on during the transaction at closing, that money can be reimbursed to their bank account to leave them with a cushion amount of money once they're in their new home. The next thing here is an inspection. Okay, so that inspection is almost in no circumstances going to be able to be covered by the seller, the assistance, or adjusting the interest rate. Last one here is the appraisal. Okay, so that appraisal, obviously that money needs to come from the borrower up front once again, but it's possible for that to be covered by the seller as part of something called seller concessions, which is what we're seeing less and less of now. In this marketplace. It was much more prevalent back in late 2011. It was very rare to see a transaction that didn't have seller concessions covering many of these expenses. But today, seller concessions are much less prevalent out there. So that's a possibility, but I would not consider it to be a probability right up front. The next thing is this appraisal can actually be reimbursed back to the buyer or the borrower by a down payment assistance program. So the way that that looks is the person would pay for the appraisal up front, and then once again at closing, the down payment assistance program could reimburse their account to leave them with a cushioned reserve amount of money. Also, the interest rate. So this is where the interest rate starts coming into play. We can actually adjust the interest rate up. We, being lenders, can adjust that interest rate up in order to pay for some of those closing costs or prepaid items. That's what we're allowed to cover by adjusting interest rate. And an appraisal is indeed considered a closing cost. Okay, so that's the upfront money and where it can come from. Now, these last three here are the parts that come into play once we're really in underwriting and once we're coming to the closing table with money. Not necessarily the upfront money that's going to be leaving a person's bank account. First is down payment. So just as with all the rest of these up above, regardless if you're putting 3% down conventional, 3.5% down conventional, 20, 30, 50% conventional, it doesn't really matter exactly what the down payment is as it relates to the fact that all of these things are going to need to be taken into consideration. That down payment can never come from the seller. It can potentially come from down payment assistance programs, and it cannot come from the interest rate because the interest rate can only be adjusted to cover closing costs and prepaid items, and down payment is not a closing cost or prepaid item. Next thing here are closing costs. So I would consider this to be closing cost and prepaid items, meaning prepaid forward taxes and insurance. This can possibly come from the seller in the form of seller concessions. It also can come from assistance, the down payment assistance programs they can cover closing costs, prepaids, and down payment. And this can also potentially be covered by the interest rate. Now, another common misconception out there is that sometimes maybe if I'm taking advantage of a down payment assistance program and I don't quite have enough of the down payment assistance, and some of the programs out there are capped at a limit of how much assistance can be offered to the buyer, then I can adjust the interest rate up and cover the rest of my closing costs. However, in many down payment assistance programs, it's not allowed, the way that the market is priced with the interest rate, it's not allowed to bump that interest rate up to cover some more of these closing costs. So this right here is something to really take into consideration and make sure that you're being very well educated as to exactly what loan structure you're going after and how it fits your particular scenario. Now the last thing here is reserves, and this reserve account is something that is important in underwriting, and in my opinion it's also really important just for people in general, just for buyers in general. It's something many times that's overlooked and not taken into consideration of, if I have X amount of dollars and that's exactly what's necessary for me to buy this property and get in it and pay for these different fees and costs, then I need to make sure I have that. The reserve account would basically say I need to have that plus some. Probably at least a couple, maybe few months of reserves, and it depends on the loan structure that you're going after once again. So this reserve account is something else that's important to keep in the back of your mind when you're thinking about purchasing a property. This is also why these down payment assistance programs can reimburse things such as earnest, appraisal, those things that come out of a person's account up front and then are reimbursed back to them to allow them some of that cushion. So these reserves are not going to be able to come from the seller. They may be able to come from down payment assistance, depending on the structure. And depending on how you want to look at it, if you are going to adjust the interest rate to cover some of your closing costs, then maybe the rate is helping you with this reserve account. It's not directly tied to padding that reserve account or keeping money in your account, but it could be looked at that way, that it's helping your reserve account because you can adjust your interest rate up to cover closing costs. So this is just kind of the scratch of the surface of what to expect when you're looking at how you want to structure a home purchase and making sure that you are moving forward in a deliberate manner, really confidently, and knowing your scenario and knowing the expectations all the way through. Hope you found this information helpful, and I will see you soon.